The modular Rev ambulance rocketed through the mid-afternoon traffic on Interstate 240, its siren wailing. Inside, a team of paramedics worked frantically over a lifeless body. The patient, a man in his 40s, was dressed in pajama bottoms and a gold chain. His skin was cold and blue, and his lips were the same ghastly shade. As the ambulance screeched to a stop at Baptist Memorial Hospital, a swarm of men emerged, their faces grim. They wheeled the stretcher inside, stealing quick glances at the onlookers who had gathered. In the emergency room, a receptionist hastily filled out an admission form. She wrote, "Mr. John Doe, age 42, self-employed entertainer, suffering from cardiac arrest." The form was marked with a stern warning, "No publicity." The patient was Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, but no one was supposed to know that yet. A nurse, Marion Koch, recognized him and carefully removed a gold necklace from his neck, stashing it for safekeeping. The emergency room was a hive of activity, with a team of doctors and nurses working to bring him back to life. Dr. Otis War III, the head of the trauma team, ordered a series of emergency procedures. They injected epinephrine and isoprol to stimulate Elvis's heart, and sodium bicarbonate to try and revive him. They even performed a thoracotomy, cutting into his chest to massage his heart directly, but nothing worked. Elvis was cold, his chest hard to pump and his lips blue. A nurse, Kim Davis, couldn't help but ask, "Why are we working on this corpse? He's dead." One of her teammates replied with a solemn look, "Because he's Elvis Presley." Meanwhile, Dan Warlick, the sole investigator for the Shelby County Medical Examiner's Office, was dealing with a routine arrest. It was a hot August day, and Warlick, a man in his late 20s, was sweating profusely. He had agreed to help two friends from the sheriff's department serve a warrant for a man who had exposed himself on a Memphis sidewalk. After a successful arrest, Warlick returned to his office, expecting a quiet afternoon. But as he stepped into the elevator, the atmosphere was electric. Secretaries and technicians were bustling, and the phones were ringing off the hook. Dr. James S. Bell, the office's portly and chain-smoking chief, was in a panic. He grabbed Warlick by the lapels and handed him a piece of notepaper. It read, "Ep ad doa bimach." Warlick's heart skipped a beat. Ep could only mean one thing: Elvis Presley. Odd suggested a possible drug overdose, and doa bimach meant he was dead on arrival at Baptist Memorial Hospital. Warlick's mind raced. This was the biggest case he had ever encountered. But before he could act, he needed to verify the information. He called Baptist Hospital and confirmed that Elvis Presley, admitted as John Doe, was indeed dead. The futile attempts to revive him were still ongoing, but the outcome was clear. Warlick then called the medical school, interrupting Dr. Jerry T. Francisco, their boss, in a meeting. He relayed the news and said he was heading to the emergency room. Before leaving, Warlick instructed Bell to contact the Homicide Bureau and set up a rendezvous with detectives at Baptist Hospital. As he rushed out, he couldn't shake the gravity of the situation. Elvis Presley, the king, was dead. And now, the real work of uncovering the truth was about to begin. The Memphis police were already on the scene when Jimmy Warlick, a homicide detective, arrived. As he stepped onto the street, he spotted Lieutenant Sam McCachran, a big, strong police veteran dressed in a simple suit and a narrow tie. McCachran had been a cop for 25 years, and was planning to retire to a quiet life in rural Mississippi next year. Together, they headed toward the emergency room, where a huge crowd was gathered. People were buzzing with excitement and fear, saying that Elvis Presley had been brought there by ambulance. Transistor radios in the crowd were blaring that Elvis was in respiratory distress, meaning he wasn't breathing. Warlick and McCachran pushed through the crowd and showed their badges at a side door. Inside the emergency room, they saw doctors and nurses in white coats mixed with security guards and uniformed police. The scene was chaotic. Warlick noticed that McCachran seemed out of his element, more at ease dealing with violent crimes than this kind of madness. They entered trauma room No. 2, where a medical team was still trying to save Elvis. Warlick saw that Elvis's body was already showing signs of livor mortis, a purple color that appears when someone has been dead for more than 2 hours. The stiffness of Elvis's body told Warlick that he had been dead for much longer. It was 3:40. Dr. George C. Nishapoulos, known as Dr. Nick, was there too. Dr. Nick told the medical team, "It's no good, he's gone." The team stopped their efforts, and Warlick instructed the hospital staff not to move the body without permission from the medical examiner's office. The body was placed in a cooler, and a police officer was stationed to guard it. Warlick knew this case was different. He was determined to handle it by the book, remembering the postmortem statute in Tennessee. He didn't want the case to become a mess like President Kennedy's, where the medical examiner in Dallas was overruled by the Secret Service. Dr. Nick wanted to go back to Graceland to tell Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, about the failed resuscitation. He took an autopsy consent form with him and told Morris Elliott, the hospital administrator, not to release any news until he confirmed that Vernon knew. McEachran led the way through the hospital corridors to the administrative offices. Warlick followed, and he noticed a third person with them, Jerry Stauffer, a young assistant district attorney. Stauffer was eager to be part of a big case, and had been hanging around the homicide bureau when McEachran got the call. Stauffer carried a small plastic vial for his chewing tobacco, and he was excited to be involved. In Elliott's office, the phones were ringing nonstop. Secretaries were trying to handle the calls and keep the reporters at bay. Elliott was worried about how to manage the situation. He needed information quickly, not just for the press but for Elvis's close friends, who were in a back room. Warlick and the others met Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager. Esposito was wearing a jogging suit and a gold lightning bolt necklace with the initials TCB, meaning taking care of business. Esposito was a skilled manager, but he was struggling to keep his emotions in check. He had called Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager in Maine, to tell him the news. Esposito told the investigators about the events at Graceland that morning. Elvis had been playing racquetball until 6 a.m., and then went to bed with his girlfriend, Ginger Alden. At 2 p.m., Ginger called for help because Elvis was lying unconscious on the bathroom floor. A bodyguard named Al Strada found Elvis and called for help. When Esposito arrived, he saw Elvis in a flexed position on the floor, with his tongue out and his jaw stiff. Esposito tried mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and called for an ambulance. Despite the signs of Elvis's condition, they moved his body to the bedroom. Later, Esposito would tell the press that Elvis was found in his bed, but that wasn't what the paramedics found at Graceland. The night before, Sam Thompson, one of Elvis's bodyguards, was in the kitchen at Graceland. He had been working for Elvis for a year, and was planning to leave by September 1st. Thompson was worried about Elvis's drug use, and the tension between him and Elvis's new girlfriend, Ginger Alden. Thompson and the other staff members felt that Ginger wasn't taking good care of Elvis, especially with his medication. Elvis's 9-year-old daughter, Lisa Marie, had been visiting, and her mother, Priscilla, was getting angry. Elvis kept delaying sending Lisa Marie back, and Thompson was waiting for the right moment to take her to her mother. Little did he know that the next day would be the last time Elvis was alive. Thompson looked up from his card game and saw Elvis coming down the kitchen stairs. With him were Ginger Alden, Billy Smith, one of his cousins, and Charlie Hodge, the rhythm guitar player who always seemed to be by Elvis's side. Elvis said he was going to see Dr. Lester Hoffman, a dentist, to get a filling. It was strange to see Elvis going to a dentist at 11 p.m., but that was just how things were with him. The city was used to his odd hours, and people were always ready to accommodate his schedule. Elvis and his group headed out the back door to the carport, where a low Black Stutz Blackhawk was waiting. Elvis didn't say anything about what to do with Lisa Marie, so Thompson waited until he came back. When Elvis returned at 2 a.m., he went straight upstairs, but soon he called Thompson on the kitchen phone. Elvis told him to fly to California with Lisa Marie later that afternoon. Thompson knew it was going to be a long day. After dropping Lisa Marie off in Los Angeles, he had to fly back to Portland, Maine, to join Elvis and the entourage for the first leg of the concert tour. Thompson went home and went to bed around 5. At 2:30 p.m., Thompson was packing his bags when he heard about an emergency at Graceland. A fire truck was called to the house, and by 3 p.m., Thompson was almost at the front gates. As he drove through, he saw David Stanley, one of Elvis's stepbrothers, speeding down the driveway in his Datsun 240Z. Stanley stopped and said, "Have you heard the news? Elvis is dead." He then sped off. Outside the gates, There were always people waiting for a glimpse of Elvis. When the ambulance arrived at 2:33 p.m., one of the onlookers, Martin Davis, said it almost ran him over. He saw Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, rush in, but it was actually Dr. Nishapoulos, Elvis's doctor. The paramedics, Ulysses Jones and Charlie Crosby, were called to Graceland for a patient who had passed out or was having trouble breathing. They didn't know it was Elvis until they saw him lying on the floor of the bathroom, naked except for his gold pajama bottoms. The room was in chaos. People were crying and telling the paramedics to do something. Charlie Hodge was pleading, "Don't die, please don't die." Vernon Presley saw Elvis and cried, "Oh no, my son is dead." Vernon clutched his chest, and the paramedics feared he might have a heart attack. Al Strada, one of Elvis's bodyguards, told the paramedics that they thought Elvis had overdosed. Strada promised to find the medicine, but he never did. The paramedics tried to revive Elvis using CPR, but it was too late. Elvis's body was cold and beginning to stiffen. They wheeled him downstairs to the ambulance, and Dr. Nishapoulos joined them. Nishapoulos tried to help, but it was hopeless. He told the paramedics to take Elvis to Baptist Hospital, even though it was farther away. The ambulance arrived at the hospital at 2:56 p.m., and Elvis was pronounced dead. Dr. Nishapoulos asked the paramedics to take him back to Graceland to tell Vernon the news. Nishapoulos was worried that Vernon might have another heart attack. When they arrived, Nishapoulos met with Vernon and other family members. Nishapoulos persuaded Vernon to sign an autopsy consent form. Sam Thompson, who was at Graceland, saw the paramedics return to clean up the scene. But when they went back upstairs, they found everything had been cleaned up, the bed made and the papers gone. Meanwhile, Dan Warlick, the medical examiner's investigator, was on his way to Graceland. He grabbed a Polaroid camera to take pictures of the scene. Warlick and his team arrived at Graceland and found that the police had secured the area. They went inside to investigate, but the cleanup had removed some of the evidence. Thompson was told to take charge of security at Graceland. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but at least he didn't have to go to California with Lisa Marie. The little girl would stay in Memphis until her mother decided what to do. Thompson was hanging up the phone when he saw the paramedics entering the mansion again. They were surprised to find everything cleaned up, but the investigation was just beginning. Warlick walked into Graceland, the home of Elvis Presley, with a heavy heart. He had never been there before, and he knew he needed to keep his mind sharp. He was there to gather evidence for Francisco, another investigator. As he stepped into the entrance hall, the thick, gaudy carpets and garish Spanish drawings on the walls caught his eye. But it was the little girl he saw next that truly affected him. She was being comforted by a middle-aged woman in a white dress, and her face looked remarkably like a younger Elvis. Warlick recognized her as Lisa Marie Presley, Elvis's only child. She was crying, and Warlick felt a pang of sadness. She just lost her daddy, he thought to himself. He reminded himself to do his job right, to remember that these were real people with real feelings. Down the hall, Warlick saw a beefy, red-faced man with white hair. It was Vernon Presley, Elvis's father. Vernon was on the phone, his voice breaking as he said, "My baby is dead. They've taken him. He's gone. My baby has died." Then Vernon burst into tears, his body shaking with uncontrolled sobs. Warlick felt a lump in his throat. He had seen many bad things in his job, but this was different. This was Elvis Presley, a man who was more than just a celebrity to so many people. Warlick felt a wave of somberness wash over him. Sam Thompson, one of Elvis's staff, led Warlick and the other investigators up the stairs to Elvis's bedroom suite. They had to unlock a couple of doors to get there. Inside, the room was a mix of childish and serious. There were teddy bears everywhere, but there was also a large desk with a placard that read, "Elvis Presley, the Boss." The walls were covered in leather, and the decor, while expensive, was what Warlick called your basic tacky. On the desk, he noticed a syringe, empty and without a needle. This was a stark reminder of why they were there. Warlick and the others moved into the bedroom. The bed was enormous, and there were several TV positioned to face it. On the bookcase, Warlick found another syringe just like the first. "This is really making me wonder what was going on here," Warlick thought. Over on a chest of drawers, he saw a pistol. Elvis was known for his love of guns, and the room had several more. The bedroom was sealed off from the outside world, with the windows blocked out, creating a timeless feel. But something was wrong. "The bed's been made up," Warlick exclaimed. "It shouldn't have been made. Someone has cleaned up the place." He was angry and asked Sam Thompson if the bathroom had also been cleaned. Thompson admitted that the maid had cleaned both the bedroom and the bathroom. Esposito, another investigator, joined the group. He had tried to comfort Vernon and made another call to Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager. Esposito led them to the bathroom, which was more like a dressing room. The carpet was deep red, and there was a black toilet with a padded seat. There were TV, phones, and comfortable armchairs. The shower was large, and the sink counter was long, with a mirror rimmed in oversized light bulbs. Warlick examined a black bag on the counter, similar to a doctor's bag. Inside, there were tiny black plastic drawers, but they were all empty. This was strange, as Warlick had never seen a room without any drugs before. "Where are they?" he wondered. Esposito pointed to the floor beyond the toilet and said, "He was found here." The body was on its left side, knees drawn, and gold pajama bottoms down past the knees. There was blood in his nostrils. Warlick asked if Esposito was sure about the position, remembering a different story Esposito had given at the hospital. Al Strada, one of Elvis's bodyguards, confirmed Esposito's account and added that Elvis was reading a book when he was stricken. The book was lying open and face down on the counter, among tumbled-over cologne and aftershave bottles. Warlick thought Elvis had tossed the book when he first felt ill. Esposito said Elvis was clutching the book when he found him, but Warlick didn't believe this. Warlick examined the book. It was a large volume with glossy illustrations, full of graphic content. It was raunchy pornography, Warlick said. Hardcore by 1977 standards. It was a combination of sex and astrology. Warlick was surprised by the claims that Elvis was reading a book about mysticism or religion. He knew this was not the case. Warlick noticed a moist discoloration on the carpet where Elvis's head had come to rest. He sniffed it and detected the odor of vomit and gastric fluid. He lay down on the carpet and stretched out, trying to retrace Elvis's last moments. He realized Elvis had stumbled or crawled several feet before he died, not just fallen off the toilet. Warlick took some photos and returned to the office, where Ginger Alden, Elvis's girlfriend, was waiting. She was a beautiful woman, but Warlick noticed she seemed more focused on her appearance than on the events that had transpired. She told Warlick about a trip to the dentist the night before, where Elvis had some routine work done. They returned to Graceland and played racquetball until 6. Elvis went upstairs to his bedroom with his cousin, Billy Smith. Billy left shortly after, and later, Elvis called for his stepbrother, Ricky Stanley, to bring up some sleeping pills. Ginger didn't mention this to Warlick at first. Ginger said around 8 a.m. Elvis was having trouble sleeping and went to the bathroom to read. She described the book as one about psychic energy, which Warlick found amusing. Later, Ginger realized Elvis wasn't in bed and called out for him. When she got no response, she went to the bathroom and found his body around 1 p.m., about 30 minutes to an hour earlier than the 2 p.m. distress call. As Ginger was finishing, Dr. George Nishapoulos, Elvis's personal physician, entered the room. Warlick recognized him by his wavy, stark white hair and his soft-spoken, hesitant manner. Dr. Nick told Warlick about Elvis's chronic colon problems, an upper respiratory infection, and some heart issues. He mentioned that the dentist had given Elvis some painkillers the night before. When asked if Elvis drank, Dr. Nick said no. Warlick noticed that Dr. Nick seemed distraught, but not frantic. He knew that Dr. Nick had prescribed almost 10,000 potent pills to Elvis in the past 20 months, including powerful narcotics. On the day before Elvis's death, Dr. Nick had written 8 different prescriptions, 2 of which were for Dilaudid, a powerful narcotic. In the early morning hours of August 16th, Dr. Nick had also authorized the dispensing of 6 more Dilaudid tablets to Elvis. Warlick knew that these drugs, if taken together, could be lethal. Dr. Nick had good reason to be nervous. Warlick and the other investigators continued their work, gathering evidence and piecing together the last moments of Elvis Presley's life. The more they discovered, the more questions they had. But one thing was clear. Elvis's death was a tragedy that would leave a lasting impact on the world. Warlick had just returned from Graceland, and he was still piecing together the puzzle pieces of Elvis's death. He had spoken to Dr. Nishapoulos, Elvis's personal physician, who seemed to have very little to say about what might have caused Elvis's sudden passing. Nishapoulos mentioned that the only medications he prescribed for Elvis were kept by a nurse, Tish Henley, who lived on the estate. When Warlick talked to Henley, she revealed that Elvis had taken 2 Valiums and possibly another unnamed pill during the late evening or early morning. Despite this, Nishapoulos couldn't offer any solid theories about Elvis's death. Warlick was satisfied with the information he had gathered. He had spoken to Nishapoulos, the nurse, and the people who first found Elvis's body. He also took photographs and put a hold on the body to ensure it wasn't moved before the autopsy. McEachran, another officer, called the homicide command post to report what they had found. They were planning to bring Warlick and Stauffer back to the hospital for the autopsy. As they left Graceland, Warlick noticed the county sheriff, Eugene Barksdale, entering the mansion to console Vernon Presley, Elvis's father. Warlick and McEachran knew Barksdale wasn't there to investigate. He was just there to be seen. They shrugged and left. On the drive back to the hospital, Warlick's mind was still on the clean, sanitized bathroom at Graceland. He found it suspicious that there were no drugs in sight, but he had still managed to find some clues, like 2 syringes and an empty doctor's bag. At the hospital, the mood was tense. The autopsy was about to begin, and the room was filled with a mix of medical examiners and hospital pathologists. The medical examiners, like Warlick's boss, Dr. Jerry Francisco, were used to dealing with sudden and unexplained deaths. They often worked in morgues and were focused on finding the official cause of death. Hospital pathologists, on the other hand, usually dealt with living patients and only performed autopsies to understand the disease process. Warlick was surprised to see that Francisco wasn't ready to dive into the autopsy. He was smoking a cigarette and seemed disinterested in Warlick's findings. Warlick tried to explain the clues he found, but Francisco cut him off and invited him to witness the autopsy instead. The room was set up for the procedure. Elvis's body was on a surgical table, and a drain was ready to catch any fluids. Bright lights illuminated the scene. Warlick put on a lab coat and gloves, ready to participate. Dr. E. Eric Muirhead, the chief of pathology at Baptist Hospital, stood next to Francisco. Muirhead was a respected doctor with years of experience, and he was not pleased that Francisco was taking over the case. He had a history of disagreeing with Francisco, who often preferred to rely on the hospital's findings rather than doing his own work. Dr. Harold Sexton, one of Muirhead's top assistants, was in charge of collecting samples. He had brought in extra containers to ensure that both the hospital and the medical examiner's office would have their own samples. Another pathologist, Dr. George Bale, was ready to help, and Dr. Thomas Chesney would later analyze tissue samples. Dr. Noel Florendo was setting up an electron microscope, and several other pathologists were on hand to assist as needed. The room was packed with about 15 people, including doctors, security, and police. Nishapoulos, Elvis's doctor, had just arrived with the autopsy permission form signed by Vernon Presley. Nishapoulos looked tired and didn't have much to say, but he provided some background on Elvis's medical history. Medical charts from Elvis's previous hospital stays were also in the room. Some of the records were under fake names like Aaron Civil, which was an anagram of Elvis's first and middle names. Muirhead had already noted that Elvis had been admitted for drug detoxification and methadone treatments before. Before the autopsy began, Warlick took a moment to examine Elvis's body. He looked for needle marks, but found none on the arms. This wasn't surprising, as Elvis was known to prefer intramuscular injections. The autopsy was about to begin, and the room was filled with a mix of tension and curiosity. Everyone knew that this was not just any autopsy. It was the autopsy of Elvis Presley, and the world was watching. Warlick did his best to be thorough as he examined Elvis's body. He checked for needle marks, even between the toes, but found nothing. However, he didn't check Elvis's buttocks, which he later realized could have been a significant oversight. Warlick noticed a small trickle of blood from Elvis's nose and took samples, but the medical examiner's office never ran a chemical analysis on them. Former friends of Elvis mentioned that he occasionally used cocaine, but it wasn't his favorite drug. Warlick filled out a Shelby County medical examiner's investigation report noting details like the fact that Elvis wasn't circumcised and had a pale pressure mark near his left eye. He also noted the sutured thoracotomy on Elvis's chest, which had been made during the emergency room attempts to revive him. When it came to Elvis's profession, Warlick hesitated before writing entertainer. Later, Warlick discovered that Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner, had copied his report word for word, including all the errors, and signed it as his own. Warlick found this frustrating and unfair. Elvis didn't seem as tall in death as Warlick remembered him from the movies. His height was actually 5 feet 11 inches, but he often wore lifts in his shoes to appear taller. Warlick didn't record Elvis's height on the official report, but he noted that Elvis's hair looked dyed. Elvis's hairdresser, Larry Geller, confirmed that Elvis's natural hair color was light brown, and he had been dyeing it black for years. Near the end of his life, Elvis's hair had turned stark white, but he insisted on keeping it black for his image. Warlick thought Elvis looked heavier than the 255 pounds estimated by the paramedics. He guessed around 220 or 230 pounds. Elvis had a habit of wearing a girdle, and even wrapping his midsection with saran wrap to appear slimmer on stage. However, these efforts couldn't hide a physical problem that made him look much heavier than he was. Warlick noted that Elvis's face and upper torso were congested, and his face was pale and expressionless. He also observed signs of livor mortis and rigor mortis, which are indicators of death. He checked for edema, a condition where fluid builds up in the tissues, but found none in the ankles. He didn't check for edema around the eyes, which can be a sign of drug abuse. Warlick examined Elvis's mouth and saw the damaged teeth from the attempts to insert a tube. He didn't find any evidence of vomiting or choking, which he thought was normal because Elvis had likely been aspirated in the emergency room. He remembered finding traces of vomit and bile on the deep red shag carpet in Elvis's bathroom. Warlick had a Polaroid camera, but didn't take any photos, as ordered by Francisco. It was around 7:30 p.m. when Warlick finished his inspection, and Lieutenant Sam McCachran entered the room. McCachran asked Francisco about the progress, but Francisco only shrugged. McCachran arranged for Warlick to call the Homicide Bureau with the results after the autopsy was completed. Isaac Henderson, the diener, began the autopsy procedure. He made a Y-shaped incision, starting from Elvis's shoulders and down to his pubis. Using a striker bone saw, he cut through the ribs and sternum, exposing the chest cavity. The doctors examined the lungs, heart, and other organs, looking for signs of an aneurysm or pulmonary embolism. They found no evidence of these conditions. Sexton collected various samples, including blood, urine, and tissue from the major organs. He prepared some samples for testing at Baptist Hospital and others for Francisco. Dr. Noel Florendo examined the samples under a microscope, while Dr. James Halbert took a sample of bone marrow. Chesney examined Elvis's heart, which was abnormally large and flabby. A normal heart weighs about 375 grams, but Elvis's heart weighed 520 grams. This size was a sign of hypertension and possibly congestive heart failure. However, Warlick had already checked for edema and found no evidence of fluid retention, which is common in congestive heart failure. A heart attack seemed more likely, and Chesney planned to dissect the heart to find out more. The autopsy team faced a setback when they learned that the emergency room had flushed away the contents of Elvis's stomach, throat, and mouth. This loss of evidence made it harder to determine if drugs were involved in his death. Despite this, the team continued their work, determined to uncover the truth about Elvis's death. The night of August 16, 1977, was unlike any other. The pathologists dissecting Elvis Presley's body knew they were under immense pressure. It was around 8 p.m., and the world was waiting for answers. The doctors had already ruled out a few possible causes of death, but time was running out. Outside the hospital, chaos reigned. News networks were broadcasting Elvis's death, but the cause was still unknown. The phone lines at local newspapers were flooded with calls from fans seeking information. Memphis, a city of about 750,000, was swarming with fans who were streaming in to pay their respects. The streets around Baptist Hospital were jammed with people, and the press was adding to the confusion with wild rumors. Sergeant Jan Willis of the Memphis Police Department's Homicide Squad told reporters that Elvis might have died from heart failure or an accidental drug overdose. However, these theories were quickly retracted by higher-ups. Some reporters heard that Elvis had aspirated, which means he had vomited and inhaled it into his lungs, causing him to choke to death. This condition is often seen in people under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Another rumor suggested that Elvis had died from lupus, a rare skin disease. Yet another rumor claimed he had bone cancer. The most outlandish rumor of all was that Elvis was still alive, and that the body being examined belonged to someone else, who had volunteered or been killed to help Elvis disappear. Inside the hospital, the pathologists were working feverishly. Dr. Thomas Chesney, the heart expert, was dissecting Elvis's coronary arteries, looking for signs of a heart attack. He made careful cuts along the arteries, checking for obstructions, clots, or severe hardening. After examining the left anterior descending coronary artery, the circumflex coronary artery, and the right coronary artery, Chesney found only mild atherosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries. This was not enough to cause a heart attack. Next, the team ran the heart, cutting it open to look for any obstructions. They found none. The aorta, the main artery leading from the heart, showed only minimal hardening. The doctors concluded that Elvis did not die of a heart attack. With no clear cause of death, the doctors turned to the brain. Dr. Isaac Henderson made incisions and used a bone saw to remove the skull cap. They carefully examined the brain, looking for signs of a stroke or other cerebrovascular accidents. Again, they found nothing. By now, the doctors were running out of obvious causes. It was almost 8 p.m., and they had promised a press conference. Dr. Francisco, the medical examiner, decided to face the press, even though they had no definitive answers. The team left the autopsy room, leaving only DRS. Tom Chesney, Raoul Lamon, Noel Florendo, and Dan Warlick to finish the work. At the press conference, Dr. Francisco announced that the cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia due to undetermined heartbeat. In simpler terms, Elvis's heart stopped beating. He mentioned that Elvis had mild hypertension and some hardening of the arteries, but these were not severe enough to cause the arrhythmia. Francisco added that it might take days, weeks, or even never to determine the exact cause of death. He also stated that there was no evidence of drug abuse contributing to Elvis's death, despite the presence of syringes and a black bag in the bathroom. The press and the public accepted this explanation, believing that Elvis had died of natural causes. However, the doctors knew that the real answers would come from the toxicology reports, which were still pending. The pressure to find a cause of death was immense, and the world would have to wait for the truth. The night was tense and filled with speculation as Francisco, the medical examiner, dismissed the rumor that Elvis had lupus. He stood firm, telling reporters that hospital records clearly ruled out the possibility. Nishapoulos, Elvis's private doctor for a decade, seemed relieved. He told the press that Elvis had been taking appetite depressants to manage his weight, not hard drugs. Nishapoulos insisted that if Elvis had been using cocaine, he would have known. He added that he had given Elvis a physical exam just 5 days before his death, and found him in good health, aside from a minor eye infection and a sore throat. But back in the autopsy room, the atmosphere was different. Dan Warlick, one of the pathologists, was shocked by Francisco's statements. He thought Francisco should have said Elvis died of idiopathy, which means unknown causes. Warlick called Francisco's words total, complete, unmitigated bullshit. His colleague, Florendo, also disapproved, noting that there was no evidence of cardiac arrhythmia in the autopsy. Warlick examined Elvis's larynx, looking for signs of an allergic reaction to drugs. He found nothing unusual. As he held Elvis's voice box, Warlick felt a deep sense of sadness. He thought about the millions of lives Elvis had touched with his music and the tragedy that he would never sing again. The team then began examining Elvis's abdominal organs, which were all unusually large. Warlick explained that it was just a condition where organs are bigger than normal, not a disease. Elvis's spleen, for example, weighed 340 grams, compared to the normal 75 grams. His liver was also enlarged, weighing 3,500 grams, and showed signs of damage from drug abuse. However, the liver wasn't in such bad shape that it caused his death. Florendo and Lamon were working on the colon, which was severely impacted with white, chalk-like fecal material. The colon was so packed that it was 3 to 4 times the normal size in some areas. This condition, called megacolon, was a clear sign of prolonged drug abuse and likely caused Elvis significant discomfort. Warlick believed this explained why Elvis spent so much time in the bathroom on the morning of his death. Despite the severity of the colon problem, it didn't directly cause Elvis's death. Warlick had a theory, though, that involved drugs. He considered sharing it with the others, but decided to keep it to himself. The team finished collecting and preparing specimens, which were sent to various labs for testing. The body was then moved to the Memphis funeral home for burial preparation. Security was tight, with rumors of attempts to steal documents and even Elvis's body. Hospital guards locked all notes and forms in the hospital's vault. Warlick's car was burglarized that night, and his notebook was stolen. The thief didn't realize its value, and the notes were never used. The National Enquirer and other tabloids tried to obtain autopsy information and photos, but their attempts were mostly thwarted. Warlick called the police to report the preliminary cause of death as cardiac arrhythmia, causes unknown. The police closed the case as a natural death. Warlick then headed home, feeling the weight of the day. He turned on the TV to see how the news was covering Elvis's death. The networks ran special programs, with Geraldo Rivera on ABC and David Brinkley on NBC. Rivera's broadcast was more sympathetic, while Brinkley's show caused controversy when a panelist called Elvis white trash. Back at the hospital, Dick Grob, the security head at Graceland, managed to keep reporters at bay. The night was long and the world was in shock. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was gone, leaving behind a legacy that would never be forgotten.